Joe Rogan is not only the host of the famous show Fear Factor or a UFC announcer, he also hosts a successful podcast shared on Spotify titled The Joe Rogan Experience. Today, we discuss a recent guest of his who shared insights into agriculture. Welcome to Hashknife Hangouts. If you don't already know, I'm Calen. My co-host is also my father, Brandon. If you enjoy what we have to offer, like, comment, and subscribe. If you're interested in our social media, check out handles below. But always a big thank you to our returning viewers. Today's topic is an in-depth discussion of a popular podcast, newer and more natural pitches to regenerative agriculture. Regenerative. Yeah, that's close enough. Recently, there was the Joe Rogan Experience number 1893. It is his most recent episode in terms of agriculture, but not his latest and greatest. It happened in early November of 2022. So we're going to discuss that. Joe Rogan saw a gentleman from Georgia on Fox News one time where he only had about 5 minutes to talk, just like a typical show that's on the news, CNN, MSNBC, that type of format. There was no real context to the dialogue. And so he felt like it wasn't fair to that man because he heard what was being said and he was getting cut in by the host because they have an agenda to drive and the little man in their ear telling them where to go with it. So Joe Rogan had him on, and it was for about an hour, 2.5 hour conversation, if I remember correctly. And so our discussion will be an in-depth and dissecting process of that conversation. In fact, I have 6 whole pages of notes for this. I took those while I was watching the conversation. I did it twice because I really wanted to prep for this conversation because I felt it was important. And adding additional quick find research points that Mr. Will Harris, who is the gentleman on the show, pointed out. Because this is an important topic and it can be complicated, we will not be limiting our time on this. And hopefully this will be a precursor to what we would do in the future starting in January 2023. So just a couple short months from now. Starting then, we will do a once a month longer conversation where we'll have more in-depth research and discussions just like today. So less conversations, but hopefully better quality content for you, the viewer. So in terms of what I meant by that is, less just focusing on a driving agenda that stays within an hour and more of actual dialogue and better quality with some actual backed up research and so on and so forth. So before I kind of get into the process and all my notes, I'm going to pitch it over to Dad for his initial take and comments.
Episode 1893.
Yeah, he's been doing this for a while now.
Uh-oh, my dyslexia went 1389 and got a bunch of Jello wrestlers. I don't know what the heck. No, Joe Rogan's got a very, very eclectic group of folks that come through there. I mean, there is nothing off the table. No. And I very much enjoy as you've got the time to sit and listen to him. He's a very good interviewer. And this isn't about his podcast. I mean, it's about the content of it, but whether you agree with whatever his political views are or not, it's irrelevant because he doesn't push an agenda. He lets people free talk and he asks some very good questions. So
and I think that's part of it is he's learned to it's called the Joe Rogan Experience because he said he wanted to be his experience. And so he takes his experiences, his conversations, and he adds them to what he's talking to a certain person and says, this person, when I've had back in the past, has said this, what makes you say this is different and so on. So he just has an actual conversation. I think that's what makes him such a great interviewer.
I think so. There's not much editing that takes place that I can see. It's kind of out there, some of the language is, an expression of sometimes the passion or frustration or whatever emotion that somebody's going through at the time, and him as well. Surprise in a lot of cases. So if you have every little rabbit hole chased that he can dig up, those conversations could be much, much longer and kind of off the focus of what their general topic is. But I thought that was a very good, almost 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was a long one. I think it's pretty average for Joe Rogan, but
yeah, it is.
Will Harris, interesting gentleman. Don't agree necessarily with everything he said. a lot of things I would like to
let me introduce
ask.
who he was real quick.
Yeah,
so
good.
people, Mr. Will Harris, I would guess is probably a little older than you, maybe about, if I were to guess, probably about 10 years older. So probably, mid to late
70.
60s. He is the owner, and I would surmise probably like the CEO, if that is what they are, of White Oaks Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia. The homestead or the farm, however they want to deem that, was established in 1866, is what he said. Yeah. And I believe, if I remember correctly, he was the 4th generation farmer on that. And it's just kind of gone from one generation to the next. They raise poultry and red meats primarily, and they run 2 processing plants, one for poultry and then one for red meats. I think because again, I finished watching it late last night and a little bit more early this morning. They do 5 red meats. It was like beef, hogs, lamb, goats, and something else. And then poultry was like geese, duck, turkey, chicken, and I think
guinea.
Guinea. Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what he is. So with that, go ahead and throw what you're saying.
Well, his whole goal, really, I guess, is, if I can sum it up, is that it's about regenerative farming and something that's sustainable, without chemical uses, without, using herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, nematicides, worms, worm killers. These are all things to get production, or better production, in most cases, what he calls, and I think he would call us a factory farm, because we are linear. I think he would, because we are linear in what we do. We have just cattle. We're not, putting out any hogs, no sheep, lamb, goat, nothing like that. None of the poultry. We're gonna again put a little bit of poultry together, but only for our use. There's nothing there for egg sales or for meat sales. So with that said, it's just like he says, a very linear type of business, because that's what we've always done. Now,
he said linear and monocultural as well.
Monocultural is basically
very specific down a road of, for us, it would be raise beef, send them to slaughter. That's it. That's kind of what it was.
But in a way, we're not doing that entirely as a monoculture either. I mean, we have begun in the last year or so to do a ranch to table product for people. In fact, last week we had a couple more animals that I fed out, finished, and sent to the slaughter for individuals to buy straight from us. And happy to say that, very pleased with the return of what they say, which is important for us at that level, because if you just have a monoculture that is sent off to someone else and handed over to them, you don't know what that animal has done, how it's been finished. You don't get any feedback from the end consumers. So in a way, we are doing both. We're doing a monoculture for sale in a factory type setting or structure, but we're also branching off of that as well for ranch to table. So we're kind of in between there in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Let me start with, I feel like this is important to say, but it's something I think we'll probably gloss over real quick, because of where you're going leads more towards the health of the animal. But the biomimicry is what he said. He wanted to create something. I think he said he had about 3,300 acres, and he's able to do all this with that. Keep in mind, Georgia's much more, the land has a much higher carrying capacity and supporting nature than what we have in the
West,
the central Montana in the West. And that's both biological and just regional. A lot of things happen, but he said he's focused more on the biomimicry, which that is where I would like to lead toward what you're saying with that monocultural linear attitude, because what he said he's done is, and this kind of, we'll get to COVID too, because he said something that I completely disagreed with, but the fact that he has something where the animals can live as they should normally, and if they were to be non-domestic and they were feral, what just turned out and to be a cow or to be a hog or something like that, he's kind of supported a lifestyle in which those animals could kind of mimic normal biology, and all he does is he pulls them out of the pasture eventually and he slaughters them. And he's saying that's different from us because what we do is we put them on the land, we have them eat, get fat, and then just go straight to slaughter.
Yeah, and those are some issues that I disagreed with. He said that you send a animal at 2 years old, 24 months slaughter age, into a feedlot, and they are so fat that it's unhealthy.
Yeah, I was like,
right?
No,
No, I don't think they're unhealthy. You know, by your standards of how much fat do they have in them, if you call that unhealthy, that's an opinion of yours based on someone who is doing something exactly opposite. And it's a marketing ploy to me, is what I thought. And but
and he went a step further and said they were so unhealthy because what you're doing is you're creating them to be obese, that they would they wouldn't live. He surmised, he said, I'm not an expert, but I would surmise or assume based off of what I know that they would live no longer than a year after what they actually are butchered at. And then he went even further to say that the natural lifespan of his cattle is 20 to 20 plus years old. I'm like, I just don't believe that. The oldest cow I've seen has been, 14, 15. Now, granted, they've had a longer life they've had a harder life because they're calving just about every year. So, you could probably add a couple of years onto that, push 16, 17, but to say 20 and 20 plus, I just absolutely disagree with that. And then to say that the slaughter animals would only live another year later, I vehemently disagree, unless there's a disease that's going on in that animal's body.
I agree. And at that point, it's about a health issue at that point. Now, yeah, there's a lot of factors, and I've seen some cows that are approaching 20 years old. I mean, we've got people here that have them. Absolutely do not disagree with that.
There's people that approach 100 too.
Exactly. That is not the norm. That is on the outside of a bell curve, right? So it all depends on, let's say you had a steer or a heifer, doesn't matter, but you make them a non-breeding animal and you turn them loose, and they are going to enjoy the longest lifestyle or lifespan probably. Again, this is my surmising based on some experience, but you turn that animal loose and you just let them go, they're going to have a longer lifespan. What is one of the biggest things that happens to biological systems that are responsible for propagation? And what I mean is the female of a species. And you look at it, you tell me any human woman who has had a baby, most of them will tell you, oh my God, my teeth have gone south. The bones, you got a big deal on calcium deposition or liberation of calcium from their bones, because it's not enough to sustain a fetus or a baby as they are growing. So that you are depleting that system of nutrients or of some of the very vital things that they have to sustain their own bodies. So that shortens a lifespan through a system of, and he was talking about biological systems as well, like our bodies. When you do that and you demand a lot, those animals will begin to break down. They don't live as long. They can't. Their systems are taxed. So you take a steer, obviously can't reproduce, or you take a heifer and you spay her, or you just keep her from being exposed to a bull if she's not spayed, and they're going to live longer. They're going to be in great shape. Look at a dry cow that we have. What happens to them at the end of the year if you go ahead and keep them? We've got a couple. Had some that lost a calf.
They get plump and they're happy, healthy.
Yes. And the rest of the cows will be drawn down a bit because they are taking care of and nurturing a calf. So to say that outright without having a lot of those qualifiers in there or an explanation of why they would live that long, I think is a little bit, you're kind of skirting around, or you're driving towards a conclusion that you want.
Well, and I think he used two specific things of pieces of evidence that, yes, on their surface, I think he might be right, but he's expanding them so far that that's where I disagree. And I think that's the biomimicry, which you could either say, that's pasture raised, grass fed type stuff versus grain fed and letting them be in one pen. So, forcing them to be in one small contained area versus pasture roaming. And then the other thing is the feed, the grass versus the grain, which I could see kind of that as well, because, you're putting sugar and additives, which are not necessarily good for us. You're putting that into an animal to make them fatter. And that's where he says, the average slaughter for his animals are at 2 years of age, whereas the average industry slaughter is 16 to 18 months, right? It's anywhere between 6 to 8 months younger. His live weight.
Yeah, it's a little different than that. It's 18 to 36, I think, is really the real average in there.
I do agree with that, but we'll just go with what he said.
Yeah.
But then he also said his live weight at slaughter is 1,100 pounds versus industry standard is roughly 13 to 14. And I agree with that.
Yep.
But then he says, he's only got about 2 inches of back fat on his animals when they go to slaughter versus 3 to 4 inches of back fat for the industry standard. I'm like, first of all, that's a lot of back fat. Second of all, again, what he's trying to say is, I understand what he's saying is it is healthier for the animal, because we'll get to that part too of being able to roam, have that natural instinct to roam and use the grass essentially, versus the potential unhealth of the grain with added sugars and stuff like that. But again, I think he's taking too small examples, and I think he's expanding them a little too much to say these are the causes for unhealth. And again, we're talking about unhealth in an animal's body system, not just because of what's happening for a short period of time. And I don't think even with his system, they'd last 20 plus years. I just don't believe that.
But I think you have to, what he's doing is, in a way, is extrapolating what we call healthy to what an animal calls healthy. What do all animals in the wild, what are they doing all summer long in preparation for winter? They're adding weight. They're getting fat. And whether they're just grass fed or you have omnivores like bears, same thing. It's a body system that is allowed to roam, a little different body system nonetheless, but the same thing. They are eating in order to put on fat reserves to sustain their bodies and to also procreate. That's what we do.
That's why it's natural for us as humans to overeat and get fat, because I think our biometrics have taught us, you have food in front of you, eat. You never know when you're going to eat again. And so that's where it's easy for people to get overweight.
Well, part of that is cultural for us. I mean,
yes.
And how many times have you heard me say I eat like a coyote? If it's in front of me, I'm going to eat, because I might skip a meal or two. I don't know what's going to happen. So but yes, in general terms, I think you're right. What he's doing is kind of, it's not anthropomorphizing. God, can't even speak this morning. Anthropomorphizing is putting human characteristics onto animals.
Right.
In a way, when he's doing that with our health, we see obesity as something that is unhealthy in our system. And I think it is. I don't think there's any argument with that. Diabetes is a heart disease. Those are two large, very huge type of medical issues with humans from being overweight that, leads to an early death. These animals that we feed out, we're not leading them to a natural early death. We're leading them to an early death because we're slaughtering them and consuming them as food. Up to that point, and especially the youth, the younger ones, we are adding weight to them in order to accomplish a couple of things. One is a tasty, something that is palatable to us as a food source. Two, we like to have things that we don't have to chew on a lot. They're nice and tender. And so having those two things really are the end result of what we're looking for in our animals. In order to do that, we have to put marbling in that meat. Now, do I like venison? Love it. Love venison. Grew up having venison. Not much marbling in that meat. And what is one of the things that we do when we shoot a deer or even an antelope, elk, whatever, in the fall, because they've been preparing all summer long and into the fall for preparation of wintertime sustenance. And we start dressing that animal out and we look at them. What's one of the first things we look at to see how healthy they are?
How much fat droppings are in there? Yeah.
Absolutely. How much fat is around those loins? How much fat is on that body underneath of the skin and between that layer between the skin and the rest of the carcass, the meat, essentially. The healthier that animal is, the fatter they are. And it doesn't mean they're marbled, because they're not. Very, very little marbling. It's almost imperceptible to see any marbling on those. And that's why that meat is a little bit drier. So it can be a little chewier. That's a grass-fed animal that still has fat reserves. So he's really conflating two different things there. And it's marketing. Let's be honest about it. I mean, he's marketing.
And he missed that to an extent at the end of the podcast as well.
Yeah, he did. That, you never heard of, as a marketing, we've heard of grass-fed beef for years, because I mean, we've eaten it. We've done it ourselves, where we've consumed it for ourselves. And part of that, very honestly, was, hey, we got an animal that we can go ahead and butcher. We can't afford to feed it out. Literally can't afford the grain to go into it. So you harvest it in the late fall, where it's going to be at its peak of weight gain and fat deposition. And then that's when we'd harvest it. And it's a grass-fed animal. And like he said, it does taste different. And we've said that. It does not taste, it doesn't have the taste, the tenderness of a grain-fed animal. And is it healthier? Depends on how you say that. I've got a very good friend of ours, a cardiologist, that I saw him tear into one of our steaks one time, and there's a big old layer of fat on the outside. And I was just kind of watching, and I thought, is he gonna eat that? He did. I said, hey, wait a minute, you're a cardiologist. I'm surprised you didn't tear some of that fat off the outside of that. And he goes, a certain amount of fat's healthy for you. You have to have it.
Right.
So whether it's fat that is in marbling or top fat, you still need to have some fats in there. So, I mean, we can argue that stuff back and forth. And at the end of the day, for that, it's really not about whether it's healthy for you. It's about whether or not you have a product to sell to a niche group. Yeah. And that niche group has grown over the years with this, with a grass-fed, fat animal. That is, I mean, that's just kind of a cycle of things.
Well, and I think I know why, but that was towards the end of the podcast as well. And we can get to that. I just highlighted some stuff that I think we might need to come back to for that. But to finish out this piece about the natural lifespans, he also equated the euthanizations of animals during COVID to this unnatural lifespan.
Yeah, no.
And I was like, that's not true at all. That was
economic.
Yes, he's either misinformed or he's creating a falsality, because the euthanization, specifically in the hog market, if people recall, that was when it was noticed the most, was with the hogs, because they go through hogs and they create pork so much more in terms of carcass needed to create the output that you would with beef. That was 100% due to the, like you said, the factory or the industry or the process cycle. That had nothing to do with the lifespan of the animal. Right. They euthanized hogs because they essentially had a batch that was ready to go to the slaughter, and the processing plants were shut down. Because the processing plants were shut down, that batch essentially had to either be slaughtered then and there or euthanized and put into a grave, because they did not have the carrying capacity in the pens and so on and so forth to hold them. Now, to his point, Mr. Harris's point was, he could continue through the process because all he had to do was shut down his plants and let them roam out in the pastures. Right. 100% understand, 100% support. And I like that method, because you're not wasting an animal unnecessarily. But to say that was due to the unnatural lifespan of the animal was just completely incorrect. And I wanted to make sure that was very clear.
I completely agree with that. And that's something I took a note of as well. It's like, no. That's not what happened. if let's say that it wasn't COVID that shut these plants down. Let's say all of a sudden the government come in and said, okay, you cannot slaughter for 30 days or 60 days. No plants can slaughter. We've had some kind of an outbreak of something that will make people sick, almost like a listeria in type of salmonella, whatever. The very same thing would have happened. You can't carry those animals for very long before you have to do something with them. There were hog farmers in South Dakota that were bringing live hogs here to Montana and trying to give them away.
Yeah.
Because they were going to kill them anyway. And they
didn't want to do that.
They didn't want to do that. So that was not about a health issue. No, you turn a feral hog loose and see what happens. Ask them in the South about feral hogs. Yeah. I mean, we're starting to get them here in the northern tier states as well. No, these animals do just fine. Now, I think what he's going to say to that is, as a rebuttal, is I'm not saying that they won't live long. I'm saying they won't live long in what he calls a confined in a feedlot area, and that's still not true. They're still being fed. They're still healthy, and all you have to do, if you want to trim that down, is you just don't feed them quite the high protein corn and type of supplement. If you just fed them, say, a grass hay that's up 8-9% protein instead of approaching 20% protein, 18% protein on some of the feedlot feeds and supplements, they're probably going to maintain their weight. They're not going to gain much, or they'll gain very, very little. But then again, as a business, you're putting a lot of feed into something that's not getting any gain.
Well, and that's another part too, that, because he has his process of he just pulls them from the pasture and slaughters them, versus what we try to do also, not just when we sell cows or calves to market each fall, but the ones that we hold back and we sell, like you said, the ranch to table concept. There's still a process for feeding that animal out with the grain that we provide, depending on what that timetable is. Maybe it's 45 days, maybe it's 60 days, but there's a timing process in there as well. Right. So that, if that gets stopped, where a butcher processing plant or something along that line is shut down, then we have to stop what we have to do. And it goes back to, okay, hold squat on everything, because you don't have the ability to continue to hold more animals as they come in. You have to either butcher immediately, and if you don't have the butcher available, then again, you go to, maybe I can sell this animal to somebody else for, I don't know, a freaking pet or something along the lines, but looking at all the options before euthanization. But that euthanization was due to the process, not the animal.
That's correct. Yeah, they weren't putting them down because they were sick. There's a couple other things there that towards the end of the podcast, and it goes to this, and it's about the carrying capacity. I would like to see his whole operation.
I would,
because he's talking about, if you take just the cattle portion of this, he said they're slaughtering 100 head per week.
100 head of cattle a week.
40 head of hogs.
I think he said 40 hogs, 40 sheep, and then about 1,000 poultry of whatever species. Right. 1,000 poultry a week.
On 3,200 acres, you're only looking about 5 square miles. It's very close to the size of our place with our leases. Very close. And I'm like, yes, the ground is different. They can run a lot more head per acre there than we can. But when you combine all of those, there's only so much room, and especially those numbers coming through. So I'd really like to see.
Yeah, I was doing some beer math in my head too while he was throwing these things out there. I was like, I just equated it to the land being, knowing how fertile it can be on the East Coast. Right. But no, I agree. Even with all of that, I was throwing it out there. I was like, that's a lot of animals, especially when you're essentially saying 5,200 head a year is slaughtered for beef.
Just beef.
Now, when you think just that's a lot. And then he's got the hogs, the lambs, the sheep in general. Yeah.
And he's bringing them to 2 years of age. So you've got over 10,000 head.
Yeah.
At some point of growth in their, plus you've got your mother cows, because on the grading system, they talked about that Whole Foods.
Yeah, we'll get there, because that's a whole concept I want to talk about.
Yeah, that didn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, And if they've got nothing in confinement, especially the birds, and it sounds like he's got them in pens, they got guardian dogs. How big are these pens for that? Are they really, they're not in cages in confinement, but how much roaming do they really have? What are those? So I mean, it just kind of, I'm not calling the man a liar because I don't know, but the credibility slipped a little bit there with his comments about healthy versus unhealthy. I was like, I'd like to see what he's got. The water issue was another thing. Carbon sequestration, another thing. I mean, there's a lot there that I would like to see. I don't disagree that he got something that's sustainable, because you can't take 180 employees at $25 million a year. And not be able to sustain that. So he's got something good going on there, and maybe it's the marketing.
Well, and I think with the marketing, a lot of that I think feeds back to what I want to get to next is the animal welfare that he pointed out. He said he wanted to provide, like we originally said, the instinctive behavior opportunities, so that biomimicry, where animal welfare ideology changed what for him from just being well-fed, watered, with comfortable temperatures, and the final one, no intentional suffering. He said, yep, I agree with all those, but in my opinion, you also have to add into the environmental extinctive behavior expression. So being able to let that animal be an animal for what it is. And his example, I thought was a good example, is, with the original of fed, watered, comfortable temperatures with no intentional suffering, is to take a kid, put them in a closet, feed them, make sure they have all their bedding, all that, and they're safe, they're comfortable, they're never going to get hurt, nobody will hurt them, nothing bad will happen to them, but they're being taken care of. But that's not important. That you've checked all the blocks, but you haven't let them go and be kids, learn how to,
it's not a life.
Right. And he said, that with that example as well, that's what resulted in Mad Cow, where they're trying to get more protein because they're feeding extra stuff. The also use of chicken feces for nutrition only perspective. Chicken feces has high nitrogen, which helps boost the proteins and stuff. And he said that's not good for the animal, but based off those 4 concepts of fed, watered, temperatures, and no suffering, that checks the box, it's fine. But is that really something you should do? And I thought that was a good idea and a great example, but I could see where there would be things that I'd be like, I don't necessarily agree with that either.
Well, that's and part of that is that's been known for years and years and years, that you don't feed animals waste animal. And I think in the hog business they call it tankage. Don't feed them tankage, which means, and I have myself seen a hog operation that was mostly confined, or they could come in and out. But a lot of the animals were in confinement to farrow, sows brought in, and a big grinder set up, because you have loss. You're going to lose animals. When you have that many, you're going to have some natural loss as little guys. Sows sometimes will lay on their pigs, because they'll have a litter, and it's just a natural thing for one little guy doesn't get out of the way, and she'll lay on him instead of getting up. She'll just lay there and kill him. They pick those up, they throw them into a tank, they grind them, and they put them in the feed. That's a bad idea. And that's exactly what they're talking about with mad cow disease. These protein, the prions, attach at certain locations biologically, and then you develop a thing called basically mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephaly. But that's been known for decades that you don't do that. But people shortcutting.
Right.
I
think that's where a lot of it comes in. They're shortcutting instead of doing the right thing.
Well, and his point to efficiency was, I completely agree. You try to be as efficient as you can, but efficiency doesn't necessarily equate to sustainability. And that was a very good comment or example of that. I mean, you try to be as efficient as you can, but to the point where it is detrimental to the animal, you're no longer going to be efficient, because your sustainability is going to be there. I mean, you have to spend money, unfortunately. Otherwise, this would be a booming business. No matter what you did, you'd make tons of money. You didn't have any input cost.
I think that goes well with actually the next part because it kind of flowed into that as well. And I'll just throw everything out there real quick because the sustainability, if people keep in mind the sustainability factor with what I'm about to say, I think it makes sense. And he said what makes him special also, part of his marketing, is that he gave up stuff. There's
Right.
no scientific or product based farming on his place. There used to be unintended consequences that were unnoticed and undesirable. I think one of the greatest examples is DDT and what it did to the eagle populations.
Mm-hmm.
He says, his three things are land, animals, and community. Land being you don't use the chemicals and the pesticides and the fungicides and all the sides that you had thrown out earlier, along with no chemical fertilizers, because even the chemical fertilizers are helpful. They're not overall good for the ground,
right?
Because they came about after World War II because suddenly they were affordable. Munition factories were now changing over to chemicals, and it was working in that result.
Right.
It resulted in oxidation, but it killed a lot of the microbes in the ground that were important for growing. And so you kind of robbed Peter to pay Paul, and it's now we're paying for it decades later. And he said, schools, universities, colleges taught you how to use the soil, but not necessarily the importance of the health of it. There was no holistic approach, which we're now decades later starting to come back to, not just with human bodies, but also with farming and ranching.
Right.
He said he's extremely anti-Roundup because it's now he uses more as in quantity products that are natural, but they're longer in application. So because you have to use more of it and it's longer, it'll take 6 months versus 6 weeks to apply, and it'll then kill weeds. He's also using imported beetles now, which supposedly he's keeping an eye on it, but he says they supposedly will only attack weeds that he's desired as necessary because that's what they're bred to eat. And he's keeping an eye.
Specific soda tree.
Yeah, and he's making sure to keep an eye that they don't go outside their realm. Otherwise, he said, you're messing with wildlife. We've already done enough of that. He doesn't want to do more with that. And I agree. The animal part was kind of just throughout the entire conversation, so I'm not going to go into that. But then his third point was the community. So land animal community, the community being trying to make a positive impact on the community. Yep, so are we. He employs about 80% of the people in his community. It sounds like it's pretty small and tight knit, so it kind of makes sense. And that his place, White Oak Pastures, actually brought in high-speed internet to that location. So he was being positively impactful on the community. So with that, like, he gave up stuff, but he's also brought things in. But I kind of wanted to throw that out there for sustainability, because that's not just sustainability with the land and animals, but he's also saying for his community as well. He's trying to make it sustainable and go
well,
forward.
and I could make that argument that he's no different than a coal miner.
Yeah.
That his town was a little ghost town, right? Just really was nothing there. And I could make the argument as a devil's advocate, say, well, of course he's gonna put some infrastructure there. He's got a company town. He controls and owns everything.
Yeah.
And where else are
the
these
same
people?
thing.
Yeah, where are the people gonna go to live after a day's work? Well, here's this little town that happens to be right there. If I put some money into this and can get them to stay there, there's my workforce. And so that argument can be made. I don't know that the man has got that kind of a intent.
It didn't sound like it.
It didn't seem like that, but I mean, you could make that argument, right? That it's not all, that's not necessarily a sacrifice. That was an investment. So, one of the things that I think that is also marketed is sacrifice. Hey, we are depriving ourselves of this so we can make this better for you. Right. People love underdogs. Especially Americans love the underdog story. And if you can make yourself as someone who has sacrificed or suffered a little bit, but yet you triumph and you get to benefit from this triumph, oh, that's a big win all the way around. So there's a lot of marketing that's going on with Mr. Harris, I think. And you know what? That's how he's staying in business. And now the sustainability part, he kind of skirted around production and sustainability in production, and not sustainability of the business, but of a population. He's hoping that Bill Gates, who's the largest farm or land owner in the U.S. now, is not doing anything with his property because he's all about population control. I mean, these are things that he's said himself. But
he used Bill Gates more as an example, and this is towards the end, but he said he was more using Gates as an example of a technocrat using technology to solve all the problems with agriculture versus actually solving agriculture's problems, which to that point I agreed with wholeheartedly. But I do have that other point that you're bringing up, which is the carrying capacity part.
Right.
How and Rogan asked it 2 or 3 times, and I think the answer, he did answer it in his own way, in different ways each time, to make kind of the holistic answer to him. But like, I'll just kind of, like, my note said, the question was very blatant. It said, how do you feed 18 million people that are in one place?
Right.
He's talking about places like New York City,
LA,
Tokyo, LA. Yeah. And because it's not natural. We're not all supposed to be in one location like that. It's weird.
And stay healthy.
And stay healthy.
Without competition for food.
Well, and that's
biomimicry right there.
Right. And he goes, I think we just reached 8 billion people in the world.
Right.
I think a couple months ago. And the Earth's carrying capacity, they're assuming, is 10 point something billion. So, we're closing in on it. But they're saying, the question was, what's the farming method that was going to carry the capacity the furthest? And his answer, Mr. Harris's answer, was, well, if we're looking to sustain humans, less land, more production is going to be the industrial model, which is what we have. Mm-hmm. If you're looking for sustainable to the earth, the environment, and nearly everything else, it's going to take less resources, more sustainable, and less destructive, but you're going to produce significantly less. I'm like, okay, I can buy that 100%. So then it got to another whole conversation of, is regenerative training scalable? What's regenerative space? It's unique to, he is unique to industrial farming. And there's a whole nother conversation, which we can probably follow after this. But I think that the fact that your question is, what's the carrying capacity of the United States? What's the carrying capacity of the earth? And how do we support those? And that goes back to the answer of, well, industrial is going to do the most people, but regenerative is going to take care of the earth while also sustaining us. But at some point, one's going to have to give to the other, because if we keep creating people, we're not going to have the space to do it.
Well, and the moment I heard him say that, and he really didn't answer the question.
And that's why I said,
and again, he was asked several times by Mr. Rogan. Here is what I thought of. I was sitting in classroom in college in the early 90s. It tells you it's been a while, right? And at that time, they said the Earth's carrying capacity by natural sunlight, without anything else, just a natural carrying capacity with no enhanced farming, whatever, methods we use, was only capable at that time of sustaining about 5 billion people.
That's what I was going to guess, 5 or 6 billion.
But that's 5 billion.
Probably the Amazon forest, Africa.
That was, everything. That's all your continents. But now here's the issue. And I was kind of like, okay, we're at 5.5 billion at that time, or right in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And so we were already over our carrying capacity for natural type agronomy. And so now we all of us are sitting in there going, whoa, we gotta step it up. And we have, again, efficiency and volume of food is what is been the name of the game for the last, since World War II.
Well, and again, right? Look at the United States, the production with beef. We produce, as a single nation, 19% of the world's beef.
Right.
We have increased our production with meat per carcass. I think it's like 15 to 20% in the last 20 to 25 years. So the steps we've done as an agricultural industry to improve and to be more sustainable, because that is more sustainable, is more meat on an animal, because that's less meat or less animals overall. That's impressive.
It is, but to his point, that is also the factory model. and you are using, and that's where I was headed, is we are using means to grow these animals faster. We don't use the hormones. So we're kind of an in-between on our model. We don't use the hormones. It's all natural.
Agree.
Grass fed. Yeah. And we do use some chemical to fight some noxious weeds, and it's a spot spraying type way. We don't just cover all of our pastures with it. We find the heavy where there's some density to it, and then we try to knock it back or kill it at that point. But we do use chemical for that. Now, I think if you were to use glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup, as a marker to see really how far spread is the influence of how we're doing chemical farming and ranching, if we really do have that many people with a glyphosate in their blood, that's a pretty good marker, right? To show how much that has grown. I don't know. Nobody's pulled my blood to see that. But
even if they did, they'd have to probably specifically look for it to find it anyway.
I think you would. Yeah, of course. But we've bought bread off the shelf.
Yeah.
Wheat production, corn production, those are big deals to take care of some of these competing plants. So when you buy something off the shelf, you could be getting wheat from Russia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we trade. We don't know where that's going. We have these shipping lanes that we're sending our wheat to them so that they can send their wheat to us. It's like, okay, this is a craziness, which is a whole political issue that I don't. It's not part of this. But my point is
politics and economics, which is having taken an economics class, it makes sense. But when you're trading the same commodity, not a different commodity, that's where it's like, this is dumb. But
right. But my point to this is the widespread use of a pesticide like, or an herbicide like Roundup, which, by the way, isn't just something you can use year after year after year, because some of these plants build resistance.
Just like cells in your body against
you got to do something. So you got to go down a road somewhere else anyway. But the more and more we rely on that, the more and more we get better production to a point. There's going to be a tipping point there where we're getting more and more efficiency out of something to the point where you can't squeeze anymore. And I've talked about this, trying to think of things that we're trying to be efficient, yes, but we're also trying to be sustainable. And so, and that really struck me. But
that was their point too about the regenerative space, though, is like, is it scalable? Because what he's doing, he said multiple times, it's not scalable. No. You can replicate it very easily.
Right.
But to scale it to an industrial model where you continue to do this at a bigger and bigger version, he's like, it's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and frankly, there's just not a lot of people that can do it because of the ground space and stuff like that. Like, I completely understand.
His growth model you could really equate to urban sprawl versus high-rise buildings.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's harder to get, that same production out of a small piece of ground. So you have to get larger in order to house something that can be stacked on top of, 50 stories or whatever. So when we talk about the Earth's ability and the sun's ability to produce X amount of food for 5 billion people max. In the 90s, when I was in college, early 90s, it was at that point of we were already overpopulated by 500 million people. That's a lot. That's not insignificant. But now they've moved that to 10 billion people, but not with the sun's energy. That sun hasn't got any better, right? What they're doing is they're moving the goalposts of, okay, now here's our sustainability with our farming practices, what they are today. That's what I hear.
What we are capable of doing, technology.
Yeah. Yes. And so if you do that and you've doubled now your carrying capacity, it's not really carrying capacity. It's a false carrying capacity because take a look at what's happened with the COVID issues with supply chain. The lack of production of oil from a political standpoint, how much availability you have to get even the chemical fertilizer this last year, and then the cost to put it on.
Mm-hmm.
Which you're talking about breaking a food chain. You're doing it right at that level where you can no longer do the real high efficient production, and you're forcing people to go without. Guess what's happening to their yields? They're not getting the production off of their hay fields or off of their wheat fields. They're not getting that because they're in competition with other plants. So it's happening at a level and in a way that I think I have to agree with him. It sure seems like that's designed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're not controlling these populations any other way. We're not doing it with our monkeypox. We're not doing it with our COVID. Really didn't change overall by a huge amount the death loss in a population. So it's like, well, crap, that didn't work. I know. Everybody's one sure damn way to make sure something's going to die is not feed it. And I know that sounds wiggy out there. I don't know. I don't know whether that's purposeful or not, but there's enough control by a few people in these industries that who knows? There's a lot of movies that have come up where that's kind of the plot. And it's like, well, God.
But he does bring that up, and I'll move to a piece that I think it kind of relates to that, because they moved into this from that perspective of regenerative space and how it's replicable but not necessarily scalable because different influences by individuals and so on and so forth, corporations. But with the question in mind of what are we doing wrong compared to him, right? Let's say he's the model, what we're doing it potentially wrong, because you did say we are kind of a hybrid between him and the industrial model,
right?
So let's go with that foresight real quick, or that question up front, like what are we doing wrong? And what he says is with that model, the current model it is with a lot of agriculture currently with modern farming and ranching, that we are there's 5 different things that we're doing wrong: emotionally, financially, ancestrally, educationally, and then business, risk versus capital. And he says emotionally, a lot of people are doing it wrong because it's just, dad did it, grandpa did it, great grandpa did it. It's always how we've done it, and everybody recognizes that's not always the answer. Well, just because it's always how you've done it doesn't mean you can do better. Financially, you put so many thousands and sometimes millions of dollars into a machine. You've invested in this piece of equipment that can just he brought up cotton, and it's a good example. A cotton picker, it just picks cotton. Then you're co-opted into a cotton gin. It just gins cotton. You're so financially invested that you can't turn. And he says ancestrally, which is this is who we are. This is our heritage. Again, dad, grandpa, great grandpa, so on and so forth. That we've been here. We're not moving. It's what we are. This is who we are. He said then educationally, land grant universities. A great example is Montana State College that turned into now Montana State University. That's what we have for Montana. Looking at our backyard, these universities, they follow very much. He said other than one school, which is I think he said Michigan State University, they all follow kind of what Big Ag says because they get fed a certain thing and they're like, this is the way to do it. And they kind of push everybody in that way. And that's why you get suckered into it. And then
funding's a beautiful thing, ain't it?
Oh yeah. But then he says the 5th one is the business thing, the risk and capital, for a lot of current farmers and ranchers, low risk, low return. High risk, like what he's doing, you have the potential for high return. And so that's kind of what he said, the emotional, financial, ancestors, education, and then the business aspect. So kind of with those 5 pitches and his reasons why those are potentially wrong, what were kind of your thoughts to that?
Well, you take a look at the difference between us and him. I think he is in a very sweet spot, location-wise and resource-wise. I mean, let's face it, most of Georgia is, my God, it's a really, really nice, good soils, as good or better than the Middle Ohio Valley, I think, probably. Rainfall, they can grow about anything, and certain things grow better there. Now, let's compare the size of a place and the risk and reward on that his is just a few hundred acres bigger than ours. He's employing 180 people. We're not employing anybody as a full-time employee, right? But that's all resource based. It's not necessarily if he was to go back to using fertilizers, chemical based fertilizers, and doing all the things he did before, I bet his production, and I think he admits, would be higher.
Yep.
But not necessarily
better.
I mean, he would have to probably go back to more of a monoculture agriculture of some sort, because you've got to start going that direction in order for it to happen. For us, we've got no ability to do that. We can't, because our resources, the one thing we can't make it do is we can't make it rain when we need it to. And there's they've got a good example of that. You know, they got great rainfalls. Their soils are good. Our soils are marginal. We're on, you know, a short grass prairie. We're up on the plains, a high plains.
Well, I looked on the Google Maps here real quick too. I've been in that area, around that area, very humid, which means high production and grass. Yep. It's in the southwest corner of Georgia, it's almost halfway between Tallahassee, Florida, which is just at the handle of the Panhandle, and Columbus, Georgia. And it makes almost like a triangle with Montgomery, Alabama, Savannah, Georgia, and Tallahassee. It's like right in the middle of that triangle. So very humid, lots of rain, lots of moisture. So yes, you're absolutely right. That's stuff that we cannot control. We don't have humidity. We don't have rain. We can't make it rain. You know, it's just it's significantly different resources in terms of land.
Yeah. So those are some of the factors that are outside of your control that you can't change. You use what you've been dealt with. Now, we used to have sheep on this place. I know. My great grandpa built a little empire out here with a lot of sheep, a lot of farming, and a lot of sheep. Not so much with the cattle. The sheep are, you know, if you can keep them alive, they make you money. And right now they're making a lot of money for folks that are in it. You know, lamb prices, sheep is up. Wool is being discovered again. Not that it was ever not used, but there were times I knew people that were packing wool and they left it in bales and it sat in a place, wasn't going to rot
for a better day.
For a better day. Yeah, that's right. So, but we've changed, you know, we turned that and we went more towards the cattle end of it, mainly because I think it's easier to keep cattle alive, for one. And that's more of our culture from my dad's side instead of my dad's mother's side. That I enjoy the cattle more. I don't care about sheep. Don't necessarily. I've handled them a tiny little bit, and it was torturous for me. I did not care for it at all. Some people like it, and good for them. I mean, I like, you know what, good lamb. That's some tasty stuff. I like it. But I don't want it every day. Mm-hmm. Now, when you have the resources that he has versus what we have, it's very difficult for us to have a monoculture or something other than a monoculture, because, and again, we are hybriding that a little bit, and we could probably do some hogs at a very small scale. And now you're starting to get into that homestead model, which is not a lot different than what he's doing, except on an enormous scale.
Right.
3,200 acres versus 20 acres or 10 acres or so. But it is self-sustaining in that manner. Now, one of the things that we do is we try to take care of this ground. In the last couple of years, we're overgrazed because of not too many cattle on it, but because of not lack of moisture. Yeah. And we got a lot of grasshoppers that are coming through and eating it off. So, but our feeding methods alone helps to regenerate. And if you want to talk about carbon sequestration, and that's just a great word for our climate folks who are trying to make an industry out of it. I think in a lot of ways that carbon sequestration is done at our place, and we've been doing it for a number of years. I feed out very specifically, not in the same spot. I feed our cattle right in a line in an area, and I try to cover that feed so that any seed that comes off that falls back in, because they're not going to get all of it. And I'm careful about what we get for feed for them. We try to, and then I don't have them feed right on that same thing day after day after day. I move it, and so I cover an area. By the time we're done, we take a harrow, and all of the crap that they have stood there and poked in one end and it's fallen out the other end is being dropped back into that ground where it's at. And we're trying not to do any insecticides, no pesticides, herbicides, anything like that we can, so that the natural microbes do help the roots and the grass that's there and existing. So we're doing a hybrid of that, but the problem with it is our rainfall. Again, as like we've said before, right, we can grow a lot, and our ground could be healthy, but if water is what it takes to support even some of the microbes in the ground, and it does, because all forms of life need water, you're still not getting the maximum out of that carbon that you could.